News spread about Fidel Castro's death over the past 2 weeks. So who is he? How did he rule Cuba? And who will rule Cuba now that he is gone? Not everyone liked or agreed with Fidel Castro and the things and changes he came up with. Fidel Castro was a leader and ruler of Cuba and took on many challenges during his time in power. There are many positive changes that came about, turning to communism, but also many downfalls that came about also during his time in power. Within this speech, we will learn who Fidel Castro really is by learning about his early life, the beginning of his army, his ruling over Cuba, how Cuban life was like under Castro, was it good or bad, his turn to communism, and his shift to the power to his brother at the end of his reign. Fidel Castro's early life. He was born August 13th, 1926 in Marin, Cuba. He was the third child born of 6 children. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. His father, Angel, was a wealthy sugarcane owner in Spain. His mother, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, was a maid to his father's first wife at the time of Fidel's birth. When Fidel was 15 years old, his father divorced and married Lina. Fidel was educated in private Jesuit boarding schools. He was intellectually gifted, but was also called a troublemaker and was more interested and enjoyed sports. He went to 2 different schools. At El Colegio de Belén in Havana, he pitched for the school's baseball team, he played basketball, and he also ran track. He loved sports. According to a 2016 article on biography.com. He graduated in 1945 and entered law school at the University of Havana. In 1947, Castro joined the Partido Ortodoxo. The Partido Ortodoxo, or also known as the Orthodox Party, was described as an anti-communist political party founded to reform the government of Cuba. Fidel Castro married Mirta Diaz Baltart. She was from a wealthy political family in Cuba. They had 1 child who was born in 1949, whose name was also Fidel. In 1950, Castro graduated from the University of Havana and opened a law office, according to a 2016 article at biography.com.
In 1952, Fidel Castro planned on running for a seat in Cuban Congress, but in March of that year, a group led by General Fulgencio Batista overthrew the Cuban government, and the election for that year was canceled. The overthrow of the government took away Castro's political platform and also left his family with very little income. As Batista set himself up as a dictator, Castro and his fellow members of the Partido Ortodoxo organized a group they called the Movement. On July 26, 1953, Castro and 150 of his supporters attacked the Moncada military barracks outside of Santiago de Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Batista. The attack failed, and Castro was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While imprisoned, Castro changed the name of his group to 26th of July Movement. Castro was released from prison in 1955 after a deal with the government, and him and his brother traveled to Mexico. While in Mexico, Castro met Argentinian rebel Ernesto Guevara, who believed in a more violent revolution, and he began to influence the thoughts of Castro. On December 2, 1956, Castro and 80 insurgents returned to Cuba on a boat stockpiled with weapons. Castro's men were no match for Batista's army and were killed in a very short order, but Castro, his brother, and Guevara all escaped into the nearby mountains. Over the next couple years, Castro's army grew and he waged a guerrilla war against the Batista government. Starting in 1958, Castro's army had a string of good campaigns and was doing heavy damage to the government in place. And combined with the loss of popularity among the citizens of Cuba, the Batista government fell. Castro fled the Dominican Republic and a new leader of Cuba was appointed. Shortly after, the new leader of Cuba resigned, and that gave way to Castro being sworn in as Prime Minister of Cuba.
Cuban life under Castro was very difficult. Money, communism, and economy were all not good while he was ruling. He was a very manipulative person who used people to put himself into a higher power. Castro would take a lot from his people of Cuba, and he would never give anything back to them. He would kind of use his power in a bad way and just make himself higher up while pushing all of those people that were beneath him and who were kind of supporting him, just push them down. During Castro's kind of ruling, for say, he had a lot of problems, and one main problem was money. That was a huge problem with Cuban life. According to an article from The Week, it stated that most of the population of Cuba survives off $1 a day. And if you add that up, that is only about $30 a month. And that is highly likely that anyone in America could survive off that. Just our style of living, a monthly wage of $30 a month would not suffice barely anyone. And life was very rough when it came to being under Castro. He was not paying people what they were owed, and he made it very hard to live underneath of him. Just living basic life was hard because obviously they didn't have the money to get the necessities and the things that they needed. Along with the money not being good, the communism was also not good. There was multiple problems in Cuba with communism. The government was kind of like a scam. According to English Online, Castro tried to make a classless society, as he called it, and that just basically meant that everyone who lives in Cuba got paid the same amount. So it didn't matter if you went to school to be a doctor or if you went to school to be a garbage man, or I guess you really wouldn't go to school to be that. No matter if you did school, you didn't do school, you all got paid the same amount, the same wage. And his idea with that was equality, getting everyone equal pay, made everything equal. Another thing that was under Castro in the life of Cuba was that he made it so that some human rights were denied. Like, he made it so people couldn't go out and buy cars, new cars, and they couldn't sell new cars. They had to buy a certain model or certain make from a certain year that he set. It's just kind of his own rules. Along with the money and the communism being bad, the economy under Castro was also really lacking. The economy lacked public transportation. Some people had to hike for hours just trying to get from place to place because there was no type of public transportation. He also had some restrictions on public speaking, like your freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. He had lots of restrictions on those types of things. And he also just didn't allow you to have a lot of rights that you should have. And although there were a lot of bad things that Castro did, he also did have a lot of good things. I would say that some of them were things like the government paid for housing and food for people that lived in Cuba, and also everyone's health care was free, so no medical bills. That was a plus. And Castro also kind of like created a name for Cuba. Cuba wasn't really anything before Castro started ruling and kind of took over. And according to The Week, an article from The Week, the education system there has one teacher every 10 students, while ours has one teacher every 15 students. So that's kind of better, more one-on-one. And another thing that's good is that there's also not as high of a crime rate, and I think that's just kind of more strict being in Castro's ruling. Castro had some good things and some bad things when he ruled.
How was Castro's ruling of Cuba? During Castro's reign, he reduced literacy, stamped out racism, and improved public health care. He was widely criticized for stifling the economy, and political freedoms. In May 1959, Castro signed the first Agrarian Reform Act. This act limited the size of land holdings and forbade foreign property ownership. People thought it was to help develop a class for independent farmers, but really it led to the state land controlling the farmers and how they farmed. At the end of 1959, Castro's revolution had started with purges of military and the government leaders and spread any media critical of Castro's policies. His government also started to establish relations with the Soviet Union, or Russians. The USSR sent more than 100 advisors to help organize Cuba's defense system. In 1960, Cuba signed a trade agreement to buy oil from the Soviet Union and make diplomatic regulations. Castro intensified his military with help from the Soviet Union. His reliance on the Soviet Union's support brought the world close to a nuclear war. Luckily, it didn't. Castro was humiliated that both the U.S. and the Soviets left him out of negotiations. Pretty much, the U.S. said that they would stay out of Cuba if Russia left. In 1965, Castro emerged himself as Cuba's Communist Party, with his revolutionary organization, and put himself as the head of the party. He continued to promote himself as the leading spokesperson for the third world countries by giving some military support to the pro-Soviet forces in Angola, Ethiopia, and Yemen, according to bibliography.com editors. Castro's rule has been credited with opening 10,000 new schools. As Castro ruled Cuba, hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled the country, settling just across the Florida Straits in Miami. Some people say that Castro's death won't be the end of Cuba's communist rule. The only way to find out is with learning.
Cuba's turn to communism started when Castro implemented far-reaching reforms, nationalizing factories and plantations in an attempt to end U.S. economic dominance on the island, which is stated on biography.com. It was soon announced that the new government would base compensation to foreign companies on artificially low poverty values. The companies themselves had negotiated with the past Cuban government in order to keep their taxes low. The U.S. companies soon after this happened, the U.S. companies felt the negative effects of this measure, which put a significant restraint between the U.S. and Cuba. It was also during this time that Castro repeatedly denied being a communist, but to many onlookers and to many Americans, his style resembled much of a Soviet style when it came to the economy and his government. In April, Castro and a delegation visited the U.S. as guests of the National Press Club. For his trip, Castro hired a renowned public relations firm to help promote his trip to the U.S. According to biography.com, it was also during this trip that the then President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, refused a meeting with Castro. According to biography.com, that May, after his trip, Castro signed the first Agrarian Reform Act, which limited the size of land holding and forbid foreign property ownership. According to biography.com, the intent of this was to develop a class of independent farmers, when in reality the program led to state land control, with the farmers becoming mere government employees. According to biography.com, by the end of 1959, Castro's revolution had become radicalized, with purges and the suppression of any media critical of Castro's policies. According to biography.com, it was also during this time that the government began to establish relationships with the Soviet Union. The USSR sent more than 100 Spanish-speaking advisors to help organize Cuba's Defense Committee. According to biography.com, in February 1960, Cuba signed a trade agreement to buy oil from the Soviet Union and establish diplomatic relations. But when the U.S. owned oil refineries and Cuba refused to process the oil from the Soviet Union, Castro expropriated them, and in retaliation, the U.S. hit back by cutting Cuba's import quota on sugar. According to an article on History.com, this prompted an end to diplomatic relationships between Cuba and the U.S. It also prompted many trade embargoes on Cuba. According to an article on History.com, in late 1961, Castro officially announced himself as a Marxist-Leninist.
When did Fidel shift his power to his younger brother Raúl? Castro took power in the Cuban Revolution in 1959, leading his country for 50 years. According to a 2016 article titled Fidel Castro Biography, the biography.com editors state that in the 1990s, speculation began to grow about the age and well-being of Fidel. He had numerous health problems over the past years, the largest occurring in 2006 when he had surgery for gastrointestinal bleeding. After undergoing intestinal surgery, he signed over his power to his younger brother Raúl. His brother had power only temporarily at the beginning of the issue in 2006 and then was assigned permanent power in 2008 at the age of 76. In that same month, the Cuban National Assembly elected Raúl Castro as president of Cuba officially. Fidel Castro reportedly was still the first secretary of the Communist Party until news broke out in April of 2011 that he stepped down from the role he obtained in Cuba's Communist Party. With ease, Raúl won the election to take over his brother's spot as first secretary. He then chose José Ramón Mercado Ventura to be the party's second secretary in command. Fidel was no longer involved in day-to-day proceedings of running Cuba. However, he maintained a political influence to a certain extent in Cuba and elsewhere. He continued to meet with foreign leaders, among many other things. Also, in the 2016 article titled Fidel Castro Biography, biography.com editors write that Raúl Castro assisted his brother in many ways during the revolution. He served as Fidel's second in command for several years. It was assumed for a long time that Raúl would succeed Fidel as Cuba's leader. He was officially selected as his successor in 1997, and over the decade that followed, the responsibilities of Raúl began to increase. During Fidel's rule, Raúl aided Fidel when trying to unseat the repressive Cuban dictator. He also led a group of the movement's guerrilla fighters, and when Batista fled Cuba, Fidel assumed power. Soon Raúl was appointed head of the armed forces. He then ordered the execution of 100 of Batista's military officers. Raúl maintained the system that Fidel built. However, he did make changes. According to a 2016 article titled Raúl Castro Biography, the biography.com editors state that even though he did have a reputation as a dedicated communist, after assuming leadership over Cuba, Raúl fulfilled various social, economic, and political reforms. This included restrictions being lifted on commerce and travel for its citizens. This also allowed portions of the military and government infrastructure to be privatized,
This opened the country to foreign investment and opened up the economy, allowing Cubans to own small private businesses. Raul appointed a 2-term limit for the office of president, each term being 5 years. When he was re-elected in 2013, he announced that at the end of his second term, he plans to leave politics. In 2013, President Barack Obama and Raul Castro had a picture of the two of them shaking hands, which offered evidence that political tensions between the two countries, Cuba and America, might be decreasing. This evidence was confirmed a year later, in December, after both leaders announced their work to normalize diplomatic relations. They underlined these efforts by exchanging political prisoners. In July of 2015, for the first time in 54 years, the Cuban embassy reopened in Washington, D.C. In August of 2015, an American embassy had been reestablished in Havana. Even with many notable achievements, Castro restated that he does not plan to follow in his brother's footsteps and hold office for several decades. Fidel Castro was a leader and ruler of Cuba that took on many challenges over his time in power. During Fidel's regime, there were many positive outcomes, however, it did have its downfalls. It took Fidel a long time and a lot of hard work to get where he was. From a failed attack leading to 15 years in prison, to another failed attack but an escape, to then, after that, building a larger army, the Batista government fell, which soon led to Fidel being the Prime Minister of Cuba. Castro made many improvements such as increased literacy rate, decrease in racism, and improvement in public health care. He was also criticized, though, for political and economic freedom. Cuban life was difficult in terms of social and economic life, and there were only few positive aspects of the life in Cuba. Raul continues to rule under the system his brother built, but he still has made some changes and improvements. He did this by fulfilling various social, economic, and political reforms, and by coming to good terms with America.